and we have continuing on chapter 5 on the history of knowledge by Charles Van Doren, and Dr. Saleem Khanani is going to start his session. Please go ahead.
Thanks for joining us. So let me just walk you through this book. As we have mentioned before, this is a history of knowledge. It's not a book of history. It's actually a book of how knowledge came into being from historic times till our present day. And the reason is that the author wants us to understand how ideas germinated, who were the people who came up with those ideas, how did they come up with those ideas, how those ideas influenced people of their own generation and people of subsequent generations. So I want to give you some little bit of background which is not present in this book, is that there is a concept of historical continuity and historical disruption. And what do I mean by these terms? So if you look at historical continuity, the book takes us from prehistoric time, and by prehistoric time is actually meaning pre-Greek time, whose archaeological remains and the literature in the form of inscriptions on clay tablets and others have led us to a better understanding of what human beings were before books were written. And then he takes us from the Greek period to the Roman period to Dark Ages, and now to Middle Ages. And then in subsequent chapters, he will take us through this process of historical continuity to our present time. Obviously, not exactly the present time, because this book was written a couple of decades ago. By historical disruption, I mean that there have been generations, we all know because of archaeology, that there were nations that were just destroyed or they disappeared from the face of this earth, they perished without leaving behind any marks of their existence. The Quran also said that as if they never existed before, but Quran gives us a description of those nations. Now, I'm actually going through a course on prehistory, which is given by one of the most brilliant archaeologists of this age, Brian Fagan. He's in his 80s now. And he takes us to history or prehistory, by which he means history which is not recorded in the form of books. So that history actually goes back to 7 million years, when we have the sign of the first human beings or humanoids on this planet. And he takes us through the inscriptions found inside the caves in Spain and Turkey and other places, which are at least 40,000 years old. And then there are bones and other archaeological evidences, pieces of evidence and information that tell us that human beings were rational animals even before they started to write. So there is a process of historical continuity, and there's also a process of historical disruption. But that historical disruption may actually become part of the historical continuity developed over the last 3 decades only, not before that. But it's interesting. If you are interested, I can provide you with some references and some resources to understand that. Having said that, let's now move on to the 5th chapter, which is about the Middle Ages. And as I mentioned before, that this book is a very condensed compendium. It's an encyclopedia of knowledge of history, but it's in a very concise form. And the author presupposes that we already have some pre-existing knowledge. And in order to fill the gaps, we have to go to other resources as well. And actually went through a book called Very Short Introduction to Middle Ages, and some literature, including the Norton Anthology of English Literature that talks about the literature of the Middle Ages. And I understood quite a few things from it. So what are the Middle Ages? So it's a long period of European history ranging from 500 to 1500 of the current era. But this view is being now challenged as well. It spans roughly from the collapse of the Roman Empire to Renaissance and Reformation, and I will explain those terms in the next slide. It deals with a very vast territory over a long period in constant transformation. Now, let me tell you that Charles Van Dolen's focus is actually Western history of knowledge. He doesn't talk about Islam and Judaism, but his main focus in this chapter is the European history, and particularly the major debate, according to him, in that period, which was faith versus reason. So he focuses a lot on that part. Now, not every region of the world was equally developed at the same time, and we know it even from prehistorical remains, that when human beings first came into this planet, they emerged based upon archaeological remains. It was not that there was life only in one part of the world at one time, and then they spread out. Perhaps life was prospering or developing in different geographical locations at the same time, but people were not aware of each other, although this view may also be changed. Religious change also happened gradually and at different times in different countries. And even in Middle Ages, what was happening in the Islamic world, what was being taught by the Jews, did influence the European thought as well. Several cultures and peoples came into contact, learning from each other, clashing and blending. It's an important point. Art, literature, and science flourished during the Middle Ages. For the Europeans, it was rooted in the Christian culture that preserved, transmitted, and transformed the classical tradition. Again, this is related to the chapter that we are reading, although there was much more literary fervent going on in the Muslim world at that time, much more by way of philosophy, while Europe was only beginning to learn those things. Although the Roman Catholic Church provided continuity, the period was one of enormous historical, social, and linguistic change, again, related to the Western world. The role played by other religions, this is what I've added, the role played by other religions and the non-Western world is often played down in European studies. So what are the Middle Ages, also known as medieval age, and then there are other ages which come subsequently that will be discussed in this chapter. So I thought that I will give you a little bit of background and introduction to these terms so that we become familiar with it as we move through this book along. So medieval is from Greek and it means Middle Ages. And it refers to whatever was made, written, or thought during the Middle Ages, and it ends where Renaissance begins. So its beginning is from the fall of the Roman Empire, and it continues till the Renaissance begins, although there is a different view, and I will come to that in the next slide, inshallah. Now, what is Renaissance? Renaissance means rebirth or revival. And I find it quite interesting that Imam al-Ghazali has actually written a book, Ihya Ulumuddin, which means the Renaissance or the revival of religious learning. It was much earlier than the Renaissance in the European world. So you can imagine that from the time the Prophet ﷺ came and he left this world, the religious sciences prospered, but then came a time of decline that Imam al-Ghazali actually has to introduce this concept of Renaissance or revival of religious learning, which was at least 500 years before the Renaissance in Europe. But Renaissance has a different connotation in the European history. It refers to an outburst of creativity, not religious. It refers to an outburst of creativity attributed to the rebirth of or revival of Latin and especially of Greek learning. So as we read in different chapters of this book, there was a Greek explosion where Greek sciences and Greek literature prospered. And then came the Romans. When the Romans came, the language changed from Greek to Italian, to Latin, sorry. But then Europe was still in the Dark Ages. Not many people knew Greek and Latin. These were kind of becoming dead languages, but during that period of Renaissance, from the 16th century onwards, there was a lot of emphasis on Greek and Latin languages and learning. And I read somewhere, I don't know whether we discussed in one of our book clubs or not, that the British had only one qualification for entry into civil services, which was the mastery of Greek and Latin languages. They thought that anybody who could master these languages could do almost anything. So those people who had only some mastery of Greek and Latin were sent to India and Pakistan, Indo-Pak, and other areas of the colonized world to become the governors and whatever they did, administrators, only because they knew the languages and literature. It is seen as spreading from Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries to the rest of Europe. Now, Reformation, it started a little bit later, but it was a powerful religious movement, and it was actually initiated officially by Martin Luther. So the Lutheran Church and the Protestant Church they started with Martin Luther. But although there were some voices of resurgent Christianity, I would say, before Martin, but they were crushed and silenced. But Luther, I think it's worth studying. Luther, actually have listened to the biography of Luther, and I think it's something that we should discuss and learn from. So it started in the early 16th century from Germany. Now, Germany was emerging. So if you look at geographically and socio-politically, the center of the Roman Empire was in Rome. But then when the Roman Empire, the western part of Roman Empire fell in 456 or thereabouts, the Western Roman Empire had become extremely weak at that time. It divided into several nation states, including France, Germany, Spain, and others, while the eastern part of the Roman Empire still continued to be strong, and it continued to influence the Western crumbling Roman Empire and the emerging nation states as well, until 1453 or thereabouts, when Constantinople was conquered by Sultan Muhammad Fateh. So in the here, this period of Reformation started not from Rome, but from Germany, and it actually challenged the religious authority of the Roman Church. It's kind of a fascinating streak. And it quickly affected all of Europe to a greater or lesser degree. It challenged the supreme authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Then came the period of what's known as Enlightenment. Enlightenment is actually a philosophical movement of the 18th century. So if you look at historically, Greeks developed philosophy, you can say. The Romans were more pragmatic, as we read in the last chapter. They were more focused on administration of their state rather than on spending time in philosophical discussion. But then philosophy, in a way, died until the Muslims resurrected it during the Abbasid period, when they started translating works of Greek philosophy into Arabic. And someone has said that Muslims were not just the passive conduits of Greek philosophy translated into Arabic. They commented upon the works of Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, and they developed their own philosophical thinking and mixed it with religion as well. So the Europe owes a lot of debt to the Arabs for translating those classical works of Greek philosophy. And then it was not until the 18th century when philosophy, the modern philosophy that we talk about, or the Western philosophy, really started to gain some stronghold. And it was marked by a rejection of traditional social, religious, and political ideas, and an emphasis on rationalism. And from the concept of an empire and one ruler, monarch, and the stronghold of Roman Church, it came down to the development of nation states, the rights of human beings, liberalism, feminism, and so on and so forth. So this is where it all started. So I thought I will give you some background of that. Now, what about the other views as regards the Middle Ages? Now, people in the Middle Ages couldn't know that they were living in the Middle Ages. You have to realize that. Now, we are living in the 21st century. We will not call ourselves Middle Ages because we don't know what the future will be. So the Middle Ages, although there were some authors who talked about Middle Ages, even in the Middle Ages, but it's kind of a posthumous or a retrospective term applied to a period between the Dark Ages and the modern period. But the boundary, the historical boundary, is now considered to be not as rigid as it was. So some scholars emphasize, and this is not from Charles Van Dolen's book, because these ideas are emerging now. Some scholars emphasize the continuities between the Middle Ages and the later time, now often called the early modern period. So the modern period that we talk about, and we say modern period started with the Industrial Revolution, perhaps, or the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which brought about a huge socio-political change. But then there was a period before that, which can be considered to be a middle period between the Middle Ages and the modern period. But now scholars said that why don't we classify it as the early modern period, which includes the later part of the Middle Ages and the earlier part of the current modern age. So it spans the period after the late post-classical or Middle Ages through the beginning of the age of the revolutions. And I think the study of American Revolution and particularly French Revolution, I would say, are extremely important topics for us to study and understand. The medieval authors did not think of themselves as living in the middle. You have to understand that. They can't think of that. But they sometimes did express an idea that the world was growing old and that theirs was a declining age close to the end of the time. I find that extremely fascinating and extremely revealing, that in every age, people think that they are approaching the end of the time and a savior would come. And if you look at the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ related to the end of the time, when I read through the commentaries of those hadiths through a period of time, it seems like in every age, people applied those hadiths to their own time. अब वक्त आ गया, अब क़यामत आ रही है, 14वीं सदी आ गई है या जो भी आ गया. Even the first millennium was a huge change in Europe, not in the Islamic world, because our calendar is different. The 16th century writers, in some sense, created, and this is in commas, inverted commas, created the Middle Ages in order to highlight what they saw as the brilliance of their own time. They were comparing themselves with the Dark Ages. So now, fall of the Roman Empire, also known as the fall of the Roman Empire or the fall of the Rome, it resulted in a loss of central political control in the Western Roman Empire with division of the territory into several successor polities. Now compare it with the fall of the Abbasid, where the Mongols destroyed Baghdad in 1258 or thereabouts. What happened to the Islamic world afterwards? So I think there is a correspondence between the two periods, between the two historical periods. In 376, large number of Goths and other non-Roman people fleeing from Huns entered the empire, and Russo had discussed that, the light in the dark ages. That was the chapter. In 476, the Germanic barbarian king Odoacer deposed the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire in Italy, Romulus Augustus. So Germany was emerging as a force way before France. And it's an important thing to remember, and way before England, what we call England today. And if we read the history, France, Germany, and England have been at loggerheads, at fights with each other. Now, interestingly, I found that the word barbar or Berber actually means the bearded people. But unfortunately, it started to be applied to Muslims as well. They were coming from Africa and they had beard, and they were called Mazallah, barbaric people. But barbars actually meaning is bearded. While its legitimacy lasted for centuries longer, that is the Roman Empire's legitimacy in religious terms, and its cultural influence remains today, the Western Empire never had the strength to rise again. So similarly, the Khilafat never really rose back to its glorious days, even in the Islamic world. The Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, as it was called, survived, and we have studied it in the rise and fall of the Turkish Empire or the Ottoman Empire. And although lessened in strength, it remained for centuries an effective power of the Eastern Mediterranean. What's the impact of Islam? Van Doren is focused mostly on Europe in this chapter, yet he mentions Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Averroes or Ibn Rushd, and treats the subject of crusades, but rather briefly. However, historians do mention that at the impact of spread of Islam in the Mediterranean countries from the 7th century and the role played by Islamic Europe in shaping politics and disseminating whole areas of knowledge, and our period emerges in its complexity. This is not from Van Doren's book. So again, the book is good, but sometimes his views are very focused, very narrow, and very limited to the European history. Not a real criticism, but just, I would say that a shortcoming of this book. But I really enjoyed this book and I recommend it to everyone. So who coined the term Middle Ages? It was actually media etas. That is, Middle Age was first used by the poet Petrarch, who followed in the next century by statements and historians like Leonardo Brusini and Flavio Biondi. These were men of politics and letters. Letters means literature, who fostered a style consciously engaged with the study of classical text and ideas with humanism, as they called it. They celebrated their times and their cities, and above all, each other. Very different from the religious idea. And I want to talk about humanism and humanities. ये हमारे पाकिस्तान वगैरह में भी ह्यूमैनिटीज साइंसेस रही हैं, यूरोप में ऑक्सफोर्ड वगैरह में तो ह्यूमैनिटीज की सीट भी रही है. So learning before this period or even during this period was mostly religious learning. अगर हमारे इस्लामिक वर्ल्ड को देखें, मदरसे में अभी तक religious learning ही है. But in the Middle Ages, people started to think about other avenues of learning and getting knowledge. Literature reflects the history of that period. Cultural studies, focus on God is part of the religious studies. Focus on human beings is the main focus of humanism or humanities. And I think the first disciplines or first learnings of humanities were probably in the Germany and France, in those areas before it came to Europe as well, where a discipline of humanities or a chair of humanities was established in Oxford University as well. लेकिन liberal arts and humanities ये वो subject है को हमें बिल्कुल ही नहीं पढ़ाया गया और मुझे बड़ा शिद्दत से इसका एहसास है कि हमारी तालीम जो है खासतौर पर मेरी तालीम अधूरी रह गई. Now, in Van Doren's book chapter, his focus, as I mentioned, first is the European history of knowledge of that period. And second, he spends a lot of time discussing the issue of faith versus reason. He has mentioned some very influential philosophers and thinkers of that time, including Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd. But he devotes like half a page to 1.5 page to some of those philosophers. And I don't think that I'll be able to do justice to them if I just read from the books. I will not go into those details, but just highlight that to Charles Van Dolen, the main revolution that was happening in that period was the movement of human beings from blind faith, I wish I would put blind faith, to rationality and reason. And actually in Islamic world, they had dealt with this issue way before Europe did in the form of Mu'tazila. So actually in some aspects, Muslims were ahead of them. And they tried to sort those issues out before the Europeans even started to tackle them. So Van Doren treats the Middle Ages in the European light and in the context of the tension between religion and reason. The late antique Roman Empire was a Christian polity. Now the Roman Empire was pagan. It was not until Constantine who adopted Christianity as the religion of Roman Empire that Christianity became the religion of the defunct religion, the default religion of Europe at that time. Before that, the Christians were persecuted by the Romans, or Isa alayhi salam ki jo history bhi padhe, that was the Roman proletariat or not Roman governor of that province who sided with the Jews in persecuting Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, and afterwards the early Christians, and that lasted for 3 centuries, in fact, almost 4 centuries. This resulted from the process launched by Emperor Constantine, who embraced Christianity in 312 and made the religion listed within the empire. Those who followed embedded Christianity into imperial life until it became the official religion by the end of 4th century. But religion posed a challenge and also became the target of challenge by rationality during the Middle Ages. So he talks about, Charles Van Dolen talks about 3 challenges that the people in Middle Ages faced. And his entire chapter is mostly devoted to dealing with these 3 challenges, especially the last one, the problem of God, faith versus reason. So this from European perspective, the Europeans were the survivors and descendants of the fallen Roman Empire. And the aftermath of the barbaric invasions of the 5th and 6th century led to 3 challenges for the people living in Europe. The first one was the struggle for subsistence or the struggle for survival. He covers it in a couple of pages. Then he talks about the world of enemies. Again, he spends a couple of pages on this one. And then the problem of God, to which he devotes the rest of the chapter. So the first challenge, survival. Most people lived below poverty level with reduced levels of population and with few comforts. And I will tell you the cycle of history where there is a weeding out of human race from natural catastrophe or man-made catastrophe. This is my thing, not from Van Doren, that in Europe, plague came in the 14th century, 1350 or 60, thereabouts. It wiped out a large part of European population. Then there were wars, which would result in 10 to 20% of population of the world being killed. Then we have the viruses, the Spanish flu and the current flu and all that. These are cyclical events. Most of them, you can say they were natural disasters or natural events, and then man-made by the wars. But in the last 100 years, not 100, almost, after the Second World War, there has not been a war of such proportions, resulting in such loss of human beings. But I think there is a political war going on, and the sanctions which are imposed upon countries have led to millions dying whose deaths are not being recorded. My view only. Both men and women had to work just to survive and dressed in homespun clothing. Dwellings were often no more than caves cut into the hillsides. After dark, the only light came from their smoky fire. This is all from Van Doren's book. The second challenge is the enemies. Everyone was everyone's enemy because there was a lack of central authority or civil place allowed constant attacks by pirates and marauding criminals. People needed protection. The government, the Western European Roman Empire had become so weak that it was not able to protect its own citizens. So now people needed protection that became a full-time job, becoming expensive and requiring weapons. There was a monopolization and institutionalization of protection. So वहां पर भी वो group निकल आए थे, where individual people and groups will be like the security guards. They will charge money for providing protection to you. And that charge was more than what most people could afford. The local protectors also required protection by a high level of protectors. एक group को protect करने के लिए इससे बड़ा group भी आपको चाहिए था. Only the king was truly autonomous, but on this Charles, I'm quoting Charles Van Dolen, but only so long as he kept the lower levels of protectors satisfied and was able to defend his borders from other rulers. A feudal system came into being: lord, vassals, fief, and I will talk about that, not mentioned in detail in Charles Van Dolen. So if you look at it here, अगर आप पाकिस्तान को भी देखें, the rulers actually have to keep certain groups or the local political groups happy, to be protected, to protect their own government, and then they have to protect themselves from the outside invasion as well. इस context में इसको देखें. So what happened with the feudal system? हमारे ये तहमीन अखर की किताब है My Feudal Lord, इसको पढ़ना चाहिए. The feudal system was that the king was not very weak. The central authority was not very weak. Kings gave jagirs, states which were called fiefs, to people who were given the title of nobles or lords. Lords. ये जो lord का system जो England में निकला है, they were below the king. And then the kings had vassals who were the jagirdar and chaudhris. Some of them were military supporters of the lord and they were called knights. जो हमारे knight at arms full नाम था, आजकल भी इंग्लैंड में knighthood का ये सिलसिला जारी है. तो lords, इसके बाद vassals, and then came the people, the fief is the jagir, and then the people who are the common people who are working, who are mostly farmers, because the society at the time was agricultural. And that system was instituted by the British in India as well. जो नवाबजादे और जागीरदार चौधरी साहब, उनके नीचे उनके तहसीलदार जो कुछ भी हैं, और उनके नीचे बेचारे जिनको वो माज़अल्लाह कम्मी और कारी कहा करते थे. So that system was in vogue in Europe for centuries, and it was then imported wherever the British went and colonized the world. I'm trying to correlate it from my own experiences. I may be wrong. Now, the major part of this book is the third challenge, dealing with religion. And Van Doren focuses on this part. The Greeks and particularly the Romans had kept the religious interest under control, allowing only some ritual practices. It's a cycle. It's now coming back. In the early Middle Ages, Europeans became obsessed with God. Their lives more God-centered than ever before. Theology became the queen of the sciences in place of mathematics and philosophy during the Greek rule, and the politics and law during the Roman rule. The science of theology and the Christian tension. As I mentioned, Van Doren mostly focuses on the Christian aspects. So theology is the study of or science of God. It has its days, it has its day, and its day was long. City of God versus City of Man proposed by Augustine. ये Dr. Yusuf Bhai ने भी last week बताई थी कि Augustine was dealing with what was going on in the world. On the one hand was the religion, on the other hand was people who could be called pagans or people of the world, for whom religion did not mean much. I'm just summarizing because we have discussed that. So there were two cities. City से मुराद यहाँ पर geographic city नहीं है. It's the realm of God and the realm of man. So the city of God was based on love of God, even to the contempt of self. ये जो हमारे सूफी और जाहिदों का भी यही रहा है. The greatest glory is found in and with God. God is the source of its strength, consists of those who live according to God. They are predestined to reign eternally with God. Its princes and subjects serve on one another in love. Its end is eternal life in peace, or in peace in eternal life. Whereas the city of God, dunyavi, teen और दुनिया की जो बात होती है, तो दुनिया में city of man is based on love of self, selfishness. It seeks glory from men. Whatever people do is not to please God, but to please themselves, to seek glory. It delights in its own strength as represented in the person of its rulers. और ये इससे पहले भी होता रहा था कि the rulers like pharaohs, they used to call them gods. And it so happened in the, until the Christianity that the Roman emperors also used to be almost worshipped as manifestation of God or gods. It consists of those who live according to man, not to God's law, predestined to suffer eternal punishment with the devil. ये उनका ख्याल था. हमारा भी यही ख्याल है. माज़अल्लाह, क्या किया जाए? Its princes and nations are ruled by the love of ruling. Its end is earthly peace. जो हमारे लोगों में कहते हैं कि आखिरत में कुछ नहीं मिलेगा, सिर्फ दुनिया में ही मिलेगा अगर इस तरह जियोगे तो. Now, how are they different? In other words, what should the form of government be? For example, the peace. Where does the peace come from? So peace in the city of man, civil peace in the city of man involves a balance of forces, willingness to compromise, and acceptance of just authority, the establishment of the lines of authority, the acknowledgement of a private domain beyond authority's reach. ये आजकल यूरोपियन लिबर्टी की जो बातें आ रही हैं, freedom of human being, ये इसमें encapsulated हो जाता है. Whereas peace in the city of God, here the only authority is God. And Dante की book जो है वो उस पर इसने काफी कुछ लिखा हुआ है. Divine Comedy, उसके 3 parts हैं. His will is our peace. If we freely choose what God chooses for us, then we are free. Not that we are free. Otherwise, we are enslaved by our own desires. Yes, आपको लग रहा होगा कि ये Sufism की सारी बातें आ रही हैं यहाँ पर. But is there a really private domain? Charles Van Dolen कहना है कि where God has nothing to do, where you can live your life the way you want to live. So a private domain where a person is free to do what he or she wants is acknowledged and protected in the city of man. In the city of God, nothing can be hidden. We give ourselves to God's will. But the question is, how do we know God's will? It's an extremely important question that he is raising. And this is where Martin Luther and the whole movement of Protestantism will come. That how do we interpret God's word? For them, it was Bible. Who has the authority to interpret and tell us that this is exactly what God's will is? And Muslims, we are dealing with the same dilemma. How do we know that what the Mufassir tells us is exactly what God wants us to do? The issue of God's will, for them, for the Europeans of that time, we can know it through the Old and the New Testament. हमारे लिए होगा कुरान में लिखा है, हदीस में लिखा है. Is everything in these books to be taken literally, or do some parts require allegorical reading? And alhamdulillah, Quran ने आयत मुताशाबिहात कहकर हमें पहले ही बता दिया है कि certain verses, certain ayahs in the Quran are of allegorical importance. और सुबह मेरी क्लास में हुरो पर डिस्कशन चली जा रही थी. Who interprets the divine will for us? How do we tackle contradictory passages? It's all coming from Wanderer's chapter. Does God contradict himself when he allows bad things to happen to good people? This is the question of evil, and this is the science of theodicy. Or should we assume that the apparent contradiction is due to our misunderstanding? For centuries, such questions were discussed, questioned, and their answers disputed in the West. Do we know what they concluded? Which means the people of the Middle Ages. So he says, we do not know what they discovered in their silent, passionate thinking about the problem of God, because they did not write it down. They did not tell others. They did not care if we knew. सोचने की बात है, why did they not write it down? People were afraid. That's what I think. वहां पर 2 चीजें हुआ करती थी. अभी अगर आप लूथर का पढ़ें, एक थी excommunication. Excommunication means the church will declare you as infidel. जो हमारे यहाँ जो तकफीर फतवा लग जाता है. But excommunication also meant that if you are not part of the church, if church has thrown you out, you will never go into paradise. उनका था कि मरने के बाद एक आती है purgatory, जिसको बरज़ख कहते हैं, कि people will burn in purgatory until they are purified, and then they can go to Jannah. Or those who believe in Christ only, again Christian views, they will simply pass through purgatory into paradise just because they believe in God, in Jesus. ये Paul का view था, जो Pauline Christianity का view आता है. Islamic view is different. But here church took that to itself, that until you're part of the church, until church gives you, they used to call it indulgence. थोड़ा आप अगर indulgence को पढ़ना चाहें, you will not enter into paradise. So by communicating, they were simply saying, you're going to hell, you're not going to paradise. The second thing was burning at stake. इसको वो कहते थे कि जो heretic कहकर कि you are saying things which are blasphemous, so therefore you need to be punished by death. And in those days it was burning at the stake. ये जो Joan of Arc 16 साल की फ्रांसीसी लड़की थी, उसको भी जो जला दिया गया था, यही इसी सिलसिले में हो रहा था. This is how much power the church had held at that time. So obviously people were scared to write what they thought about it. But he also mentioned there were no Nobel Prizes for theology and no earthly reward or fame for the greatest discoveries. The rewards were in discovering themselves in their hot, immediate truth and in the peace that followed for forevermore. But it was a very private peace, if it was peace. Now, theology in other religions, it does devote some part to Judaism and Muslims as well. The Jews nursed their unique monotheism for hundreds of years. Romans conquered the Jews in 63 BC, and the Jews suffered with the destruction of their temple and leading to their dispersal throughout the Roman Empire and elsewhere. Jewish scholars and rabbis studied and codified their history of law and also studied and codified Hellenistic learning. He doesn't devote much more to that, but that's another topic. I will not go into that. Now, Muslims conquered all of Arabia, the Middle East, Persia, North Africa, and Spain. Their westward spread being stopped by the Franks, which is the French, at Poitiers in 732. And this battle, we don't read much about it, but it's actually quite emphasized and glorified in European history that they were able to turn back the Muslims from taking over the Europe. If Muslims had won at that time, the entire Europe would have become Islamized at that time. Islam continued to spread through the merchants. Thank God he mentioned that. Most Jews and Christians held on to their religion, but pagans, and he mentions, often succumbed. These are his words. In Alexandria, the Arab Muslims first came into contact with Greek culture and fell under a spell, soon becoming mathematicians, astronomers, and physicists, while also codifying and interpreting Greek scientific thought. This was happening in Muslim world when Europe was in the Dark Ages. But then the tide turned, unfortunately. And he mentions, like everyone else, the Arab Muslims found themselves caught up in the frenzy of theological study and speculation that was sweeping the West. Now, he's only talking about the Arab Muslims. He's not talking about Muslims in the non-Arab world. ईरानी भी काम कर रहे थे, स्पेन में भी यूरोपियन जो थे वो भी काम कर रहे थे. इंडिया पाकिस्तान में अभी काम होना शुरू नहीं हुआ था. Therefore, most of the Islamic philosophy of that period by the Europeans is known as Arab philosophy. Now, after spending a little bit of time on Muslims and Jews, he talks about the problems of theocracy. Theocracy is the government by God's will. So different forms of government, democracy, where people have a role to play, if only on election day. This is a tongue-in-cheek remark, but it's very true. Election के दिन जो है गलियों में डांस करो, टायर जलाओ, मिठाइयां बांटो, और बाकी 5 साल तक सफर करते रहो. Aristocracy, which means the government of the best, although no system of choosing the best has ever been found to be infallible. Mobocracy, technocracy. I won't say anything more about mobocracy. How does theocracy work? In ancient times and until Constantine, even the Roman emperors claimed to be gods. हमारे यहाँ भी एक चीज है, हदीस में आती है कि एक आदिल सुल्तान जो है वो जमीन पर अल्लाह का साया है, जिल्लल्लाह, और इसी जिल्लल्लाह को अकबर ने जिल्ले इलाही में तब्दील किया था. इसका जो अबुल फजल फैदी था, उसने कहा था कि आप अल्लाह का साया हैं जमीन पर, तो अपने आप को जिल्ले इलाही कहा करें. This changed when the Roman Empire became Christianized and led to the question, how does God rule the world in a practical sense? ये जो change हो रही है, form of government, what kind of form of government it should be, and how can a government be based upon God's will? Mufti Taqi Usmani ने जो इस्लामी निज़ाम पर एक लिखा हुआ है, I'm glad that he had the courage to write it. कि हम इस्लामी निज़ाम की बात तो करते हैं, लेकिन इस्लामी निज़ाम है क्या, इसको मुरत्तब कैसे करेंगे, इसको implement कैसे करेंगे. And Charles Van Dolen mentioned that it was easier for the Jews and the Muslims to answer since they possess the divine code of law. लेकिन इतना आसान काम ये नहीं रहा है. Empire and papacy. While the people looked up to the church in an era of God centricity, how was the Pope to exercise his rule over whatever remained of the Roman Empire? This was a big issue, a big tension between the Pope. There was some control over the Roman Church by the Byzantine Empire. And then the form of government changed with monarchy coming over. So how was the Pope to deal with the rulers on the one hand and deal with the people on the other hand? It was a big question for the church. So now, how did they solve this problem? This required the establishment of an institution, the Holy Roman Empire, with the Holy Roman Emperor as its head. The Roman Empire now is becoming the Holy Roman Empire, which means a coalition between the monarchy and the Pope, or the church and the state. The church and state यहाँ पर आया, लेकिन मुसलमानों में ने ये पहले ही तय कर दिया था. During the time of Banu Umayyah and Banu Abbas, where scholars like Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, they decided not to be part of the government. They focused on their learning and formalization of Islamic knowledge. Muhaddisin वगैरह जो कुछ भी थे, they did not become part of the government as long as the ruler was a Muslim and did not force its people to adopt kufrana rawaiya. It was okay. अगर वो फासिक हैं तो हुआ करें, so long as they are not kafir, so long as they are not telling people to do things which are against Islam. लेकिन अब यहाँ पर भी होना शुरू हुआ. Now, who was the Holy Roman Empire? It was not one Holy Roman Empire. It was originally and officially the Emperor of the Romans during the Middle Ages, and also known as the German Roman Emperor since the early modern period. Germany was way ahead politically. Roman German Emperor was the ruler and head of state of the Holy Roman Empire. The empire was considered by the Roman Catholic Church to be the only successor of Roman Empire during the Middle Ages and the early modern period. The title was held in conjunction with the title of King of Italy. So although he was a German, he was also titled King of Italy, Rex Italia, from the 8th to the 16th century, and almost without interruption, with the title of the King of Germany, Rex Teutonicorum, which means the King of the Teutons, throughout the 12th to the 18th centuries. The title was claimed by various persons at various times, with the most famous of them being Charlemagne. ये Charlemagne पर आ रहा है, मैं बताऊंगा. Actually, there's an image. I was searching on YouTube and I found something quite interesting, which is not mentioned by Charles Van Dolen. Charlemagne's rule coincided with the rule of Harun Rashid in the Western world. And as far as we know from historical record, this was the first encounter between the Muslims in Baghdad and the Europeans. That Harun al-Rashid actually sent an elephant to Charlemagne in Europe, and the elephant lived there for 10 years. And the question which was raised by a Yale professor whose lecture I was listening, that we don't know how the elephant got to Baghdad and how the elephant was transferred from Baghdad to, I don't know, Germany mein gaya tha, kahan gaya tha, but it did go there. But it was like the first handshake between the Abbasi Khalifa and the Holy Roman Emperor at that time. We don't know much more about it, or at least I don't know much more about it, but I found it quite fascinating. Also, so Charlemagne was also known as Charles I, the Great, King of the Franks and King of the Lombards. He was crowned by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day. I think it was Christmas Day in 800. And why did this happen? This is not mentioned in Charles Van Dolen's book, so I had to find it somewhere else. He does mention that Leo III crowned Charlemagne, but he doesn't give a reason. But the reason I mentioned in the book is that Leo III owed a great debt to Charlemagne, the king of the Franks and king of Italy, for securing his life and position. By this time, the Eastern Emperor Constantine Velhas has been deposed in 797 and replaced as monarch by his mother Irene. Okay. Under the pretext that a woman cannot rule the empire, औरत मुसलमानों की सरदार नहीं बन सकती, हमारे अभी आया ना. Pope Leo III declared the throne vacant and crowned Charlemagne. And basically, he did not want to accept the authority of the Eastern Roman Empire. He wanted to maintain his own stronghold. He just needed an excuse, and the excuse presented to himself when Irene became the monarch, basically. So there now he has to find someone else to get his own legitimacy, and that was from the person of Charlemagne. So the interaction between Pope and the Emperor, the king gained no new power by this act. And he already had his forces, but he gained a kind of legitimacy. But the Pope continued to claim temporal superiority over the emperors, but there were a lot of clashes, and I will give you one example. So now Charles Van Dolen mentioned the emperor ruled by the will of the Pope, so the Pope said. But the Pope also ruled by the will of the emperor, for the emperor had many soldiers and the Pope had few. अभी काफी और slides बाकी रह रहे हैं. Do you want me to continue or stop and do a second section, or just continue? Anybody can answer.
Yeah, continue.
Okay, 20 odd slides hai. The ambiguity of the system, church versus the state, remained, but it satisfied an essential need, and no other legitimation of governance could be imagined. Mazhab apni jagah par khush, siyasat apni jagah par khush. Now, as I mentioned, that the relationship was not always cordial, and at some point, the Avignon papacy, after 500 years, the elected pope through the machinations of Philip IV of France, Clement V, moved the papal capital to Avignon in France from Rome. So for 500 years, the Roman church was the dominant religious force, while the kings did whatever they wanted to do. But now, because of political reasons, the seat of the pope or church was moved to Avignon for a few years. All 7 popes of this period were French. Now France was emerging as a power, as were most of the cardinals, which aroused English and German animosity. These 3 nations were always at war with each other. During the Avignon papacy, the cardinals began to play a stronger role in church movement. Church and clergy were reformed, missionary efforts were expanded, and people tried to settle royal rivalries and establish peace. The heavy French influence damaged the prestige of papacy in Rome. However, and in 1377, Gregory XI returned to Rome. As political power switched, so did the church. The cardinals elected a new pope who took the Avignon seat, becoming the first of the line of anti-popes and beginning the Western schism or split. So now the split is between the Roman church and the North European church. The weakening of the empire and the papacy. With time, the concept of nation states emerged in Europe. और इकबाल ने भी नेशन स्टेट पर काफी कुछ लिखा है, इस पर कभी हम डिस्कस करेंगे. France, England, Spain, and Germany came to the fore and took political control of the Europe in the 16th century. Basically, nation state का थोड़ा सा देखें कि हमारा इस्लाम का जो concept है कि उम्मा, we are all bound by religion wherever we are. We are still part of one community. So was in the Christian world in the Middle Ages, that as long as you believed in Christ, you are part of the Christian ummah. But then the focus came when people realized that even though they had the same faith, they were different culturally, linguistically, geographically, traditions. So why should they allow somebody else sitting in Rome to rule them or sitting wherever? This led to the birth of nation states, French. So a person who speaks French language, regardless of his religion, not unfortunately true for Muslims, is a French. Similarly, a person who speaks German language, lives in Germany, follows German customs, is a German. So now a nation is composed of people who share culture and language, not necessarily religion. So this was a shift away from religion to a national identity. And because the nation ruled itself by its own people and not remotely, it was also a state. So that led to the concept of nation state. And then the colonization started. And once World War II ended, more nation states emerged. These nation states were headed by the kings who ruled by the grace of God, not by the Roman church, which by the grace of God has to be paid attention to. वो भी कह रहे थे कि हम भी अल्लाह के ही नुमाइंदे हैं, लेकिन चर्च के नहीं मानेंगे. Never again will the Pope possess the temporal power they had claimed and sometimes actually held. The Roman Empire ceased to exist. The Holy Roman Empire ceased to exist as a viable institution. It lasted for about 500 years. Now, I want to talk about Thomas Becket. This is not mentioned at all by Charles Van Dolen, but this was a big event in the at that time in the 12th century. Or T.S. Eliot ने एक बड़ा अच्छा ड्रामा लिखा है, Murder in the Cathedral. I read it about 40 years ago and really didn't understand much until recently. I got the collected works of T.S. Eliot and read it again. So I want to quote from his drama, because it actually appealed to me, and this is what's probably going on in the tension between the governments in the Islamic countries and the religious parties, or दूसरी जगहों पर भी. So the assassination of Thomas Becket in the Canterbury, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was actually assassinated by the assassins sent by the King Henry II inside the cathedral. And can you imagine that? And it happened on 29 December 1170, and it changed the course of history. The aftermath changed it. Becket was one of the most powerful figures of his time, serving as Royal Chancellor and later as Archbishop of Canterbury. And initially, he was actually a close friend of King Henry II. But then the two men became engaged in a bitter dispute that culminated in Becket's shocking murder by knights. जो मैंने कहा था ना, knights जो आते थे, lords, और उसके नीचे जो knights, उनके henchmen, you can say, whose close ties to the king, with close ties to the king. It is a story of betrayal, of the perceived abuse of power, and those who fall for standing in the way of the crown. This is how it was described. So Thomas Becket was then buried by the monks the next day in the crypt. And as usually happens when a religious figure or a very powerful, charismatic political figure dies, ये जो खालिस्तान में जो हुआ था, उनका लीडर जब उनको मार दिया गया था, तो उसके बाद कई महीनों तक आता था, औरतें कहती थी कि दोबारा जिंदा होकर आ गया है. So similarly, the same things happened, miraculous healing, and he was made into a saint, and people would come and visit his shrine, and even the king himself, in a public act of penance for his involvement in the murder, visited the tomb in 1174, granting royal approval to Becket's cult. So Dr. Mushtaq अगर मौजूद हैं कि हमारे यहाँ दरगाहों पर पानी बोतलों की भरकर वो भी बेचते हैं, तो actually this also used to happen, that the pilgrims could purchase a mixture of his blood and water called St. Thomas's water, which was bottled and sold by opportunistic monks in small lead vessels called ampulla. बोतलें भर भर के बेचा करते. Now, I want to quote from drama as well. Let's move on. That he was faced with 4 choices when he knew that the assassins were coming. And it's dramatized. So there are temptations. There are 4 people who are tempting him. So the first one says that take a friend's advice. Live well alone, or your goose may be cooked and eaten to the bone. कहने का मतलब था कि भाग जाओ. The second offers power, riches, and fame in serving the king. To set down the great, protect the poor. Beneath the throne of God, can man do more? और ये जो जिल्ले इलाही जो है ना, अल्लाह के अर्श के नीचे बैठे हुए किंग, ये यहाँ पर भी इस तरह की बात हो रही है. Third temptation था coalition with the barons and a chance to resist the king. The kings were not very popular. And actually there were barons and princes, especially in Germany, who wanted to end the monarchy, but they needed some help. And that came in the form of Martin Luther later on. So they said, for us, church favor would be an advantage, which means if you join the barons, then we have the blessing of the church. So for us, church favor would be an advantage, blessing of powerful protection. In the fight for liberty, ये जो liberty के concept जो आ रहे हैं, you, my Lord, in being with us, would fight a good stroke. Okay. Fourth, जो बात था कि seek the glory of martyrdom. You hold the keys of heaven and hell, power to bind and loose. Bind, Thomas, bind. King and bishop under your heel. King, emperor, bishop, baron, king. कि अगर तुम अपनी जगह से नहीं हटोगे, तुम शहीद हो जाओगे, तो उसकी वजह से ये सब कुछ होगा. King, emperor, bishop, baron, king under your heel. लेकिन थॉमस बेकेट का जवाब क्या था? He says, now is my way clear. Now is the meaning plain. Temptation shall not come in this kind again. The last temptation is the greatest treason. यार मुझे जुमला बहुत अच्छा लगा ये. ये जिसको कह रहे हैं कि glory of martyrdom. He's saying, I would rather be a martyr, but not for the sake of glory. इसका जो जुमला है, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. That's the greatest treason. To die for the sake of a cause, but to die that you will be glorified in your death. This is not what he wanted. He wanted to die for his principle, not for the sake of any glory. But his life was glorified for monetary gains, as we see. So now monasticism. This was a different kind of church. ये जो सूफी जो हमारे यहाँ जाविये और दरगाहें और ये जो बनी है shrines, उसके हवाले से है. An institution that would mediate between man and God, which means no church in between. But that also changed. A spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. It filled a role that the church failed to perform because the priest and the bishops were busy with their own concerns. ये हम भी देख रहे हैं आजकल दुनिया में, हमारी इस्लामी दुनिया में. ये जो इरफान ने भी लास्ट वीक एक क्वेश्चन किया था. Commonly celibate and universally ascetic, the monastic individual separate himself or herself from society either by living as a hermit or anchorite. Anchorite is a religious recluse, or by joining a community of others who profess similar intentions. So the first one was the Benedict of Norsia, who established a Benedictine order. And initially they had very humble beginnings, but then they also started to get money. I'm just rushing through it now. The Benedictines are still a monastic order today. Initially, they copied classical Greek and Roman material. They carried the message of Christianity. So they played a big role in spreading Christianity, just like the Sufis did in the Islamic world. But as time went on, the monasteries also became rich. And great wealth is an obstacle to salvation. Ye Doren ki book se hai. It is harder for a rich man to attain the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of camel. He's quoting Bible. By the 12th century, all the existing monastic orders had become corrupt. जैसे ही पैसा आ गया, corruption आ गई. There were two other orders of monasticism, but let's not go into that. Time is short. So what did they achieve? And Van Doren is actually very critical of them. They withdrew from the world upon entering a monastery or cloister and made no further contribution to the economy or the society. और ये मुझे तबलीगी जमात जैसी बातें लग रही हैं इनकी भी. But they thought that they made a different kind of contribution by doing what? ये Van Doren की बुक से praying for mankind. हम तो दुआएं करते हैं लोगों के लिए. Preservation of the treasures of past, teaching people about the road to salvation in another life, sacrificing their own immediate good to a greater good in a practically indefinable future. But did they achieve their goal? So Van Doren has a very thoughtful comments. I'm not saying that they are my comments, but they are his comments. We do not know enough about the way the world works to prove that the prayers of holy men and women have not made a better world. Maybe they even saved the world. What we do know, ये जो practical चीजों पर आ रहा है कि वो लोग कहते थे हम तो दुआएं करते हैं, क्या उनकी दुआएं काम आई या नहीं आई? We have no way of knowing. But what we do know, what we do know is that the secular Middle Ages had to do without the intelligence, imagination, and creativity of a significant proportion of its best human beings. We cannot measure the cost of that loss. मेरा तबलीगी दोस्त, he's a pediatrician, consultant pediatrician हुआ था. मैं से यही कहता हूँ कि तुम लोग जो 6 माह तक के लिए जाते हो, अगर ये 6 माह तुम इंसानियत की खिदमत में लगाओ तो क्या कुछ नहीं हो सकता है. मुसलमान कहाँ से कहाँ पहुंच सकते हैं. ये 6 माह तक तुम मस्जिदों में बैठकर, गलियों में घूमकर, लोगों के घरों पर दस्तक देकर उनको मस्जिद की तरफ बुलाते हो. Does it really serve a purpose? Again, Allah knows best. As I said, I don't know how the way the world works. So Allah mujhe maaf kare, but this is my thought process too. Now he talks about the Crusaders. There were about 8 crusades. And why did the Crusades take place? He writes, Van Doren, the church did not have a standing army, but from time to time it paid the mercenaries to fight battles. Mercenaries ये थे कि यहाँ पर किंग की आर्मी तो होती थी, लेकिन कुछ और लोग भी जो कि वॉरियर्स होते थे. There was no standing army, but they would sell their services to whoever could pay them to fight. Their only profession was to fight, and they will fight for anybody, for any cause. They will just fight. So the church actually hired people. When the Byzantine Empire came under attack from the Seljuk Turks, the Pope Urban II called for a Christian army in 1095, and initially they succeeded. And what did they do? These are Van Doren's words. On July 15, 1099, Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders who, to quote, exhibited their Christian charity by slaughtering the Jewish and Muslim inhabitants, including women and children. Over the next 2 centuries, the Crusades kept failing one after another until they were driven out. Now comes the millennium, the year 1999. So there were millennial fears, post-millennial achievements. ये हमारे अभी जो year 2000 या 2K जब हुआ था उसको काफी fears थे इस तरह के. So people feared the end of the world, and they took it from one of the books of Revelation in the Christian Bible. It's not from Isa alayhi salam. An angel came down from heaven, laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil, and bound him 1,000 years. 1000 saal. And after that, he must be loosened a little season. So most business simply stopped, and there was a bloody frenzy of remorse for sin and hope for imminent salvation in the hope that Christ would return. That did not affect everyone, since the Jews and the Muslims had their own calendars and did not care about the year 1000. And what were the post-millennial achievements? The political turmoil between the church and the state continued, while a new class of urban merchants and traders emerged that led to the new prosperity, and this class was called bourgeoisie or the middle class by Karl Marx. यहाँ से capitalism की इब्तिदा होती है कि third power emerged. One power was the church that controlled the religious life of the people. The second was the power of the state in the form of a monarch, the Holy Roman Emperor for a while, for centuries, and then the nation states and their own rulers. But now a third class, the middle class, came into being that changed the course of the history until our time. New towns developed, new wealth was created, new business ventures and more efficient technologies came to the front. People demanded and won self-government from their feudal masters, my feudal lord. All of this constituted to a danger to the medial theocratic ideal. मजहब को हमेशा खतरा रहा है, मजहब को खतरा नहीं है, मजहबी ठेकेदारों को खतरा रहा है. So the dispute about truth, I will be finishing shortly. Now, Charles Van Dolen spends a lot of time to the tension between the reason which came through the emerging classes versus the faith in the light of St. Augustine's City of God and City of Man. Where is the truth? Is there one truth, or are there both are truth? Can one be a member of City of God and City of Man at the same time, or is it exclusive citizenship? And he talks about quite a few philosophers, including Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd. And it will be unfair to discuss what he has just summarized in half a page or one page, because you can spend session after session on discussing those. So I'll just mention them very quickly. If you want, you can read the book. So accepting as Augustine's doctrine of the two cities, is there one truth for both, or do they have separate and different truths? Is one more important than the other? Must a person choose between them? अगर आप मजहबी हैं तो दुनिया से आपका कोई वास्ता नहीं, अगर आप दुनियावी है तो आपका मजहब से कोई वास्ता नहीं. ये हमारे यहाँ भी हो रहा है discussion. Medieval men did not find this an easy question to answer, and there ensued a very long debate about reason versus blind faith. इससे इस्लामी दुनिया पहले से भी fight करती रही है. There were several thinkers that he mentioned: Boethius, Suda, Dionysius, Avicenna, Peter Abelard, Bernard of Clairvaux, Averroes, Thomas Aquinas, and finally Dante and his book. But as I mentioned, that they were either pro-religion or pro-reason, and sometimes they were in between. दुनिया के लिए दुनिया, to give to the Caesar what is his due and to give to God what is due to him. That's how they were trying to deal with it. And in the end, he mentioned the Pyrrhic victory of faith over reason. Pyrrhic victory का मतलब ये होता है कि one party emerges as victor, but it actually has lost a lot. So this victory comes at an extreme cost and doesn't last for long. So he mentioned there were many who considered the reason, the light of the natural intellect, to be a kind of intruder in the realm of the mystical communion between God and man. The heart has its reasons. That reason does not comprehend. On the other hand, there was a minority who did not see why natural reason had to bow down before the rule of the City of God, whoever and whatever he might be. Where was the evidence that he existed? अब यहाँ पर ये discussion भी शुरू हो रही है. Van Dolen doesn't go into the details on that. Much evidence existed that the world was real and demanded understanding. It was unthinkable to reject history and return to the darkness of ages past. But both agreed on the doctrine of two truths. Van Dolen's own reflection, and with which I will end. Theology had built a wall to protect itself from the human reason, and reason was no longer on its side. Very thoughtful comment. As with all walls, this one had the opposite effect from what was intended. यानी अगर मजहब के ठेकेदार का लफ्ज इस्तेमाल कर रहा हूँ, ये कहेंगे कि हमें क्वेश्चन मत करो, क्वेश्चन करोगे तो तुम दूर हो जाओगे मजहब से, बिगड़ जाओगे, भटक जाओगे. In this way, it created a wall, but beyond the wall, a revolution was taking place. So beyond the wall, the proponents of reason and study of natural world were free to build their strength unimpeded and even unabsorbed. And our modern world would completely discard the City of God and erect a new city of man on the ruins of the spiritual world. Only one truth would exist, truth of nature, and faith would be an exile for it. ये चार्ल्स वॉन डोरेन ने जब ये किताब लिखी थी, उस वक्त यही लग रहा था कि अब एक गॉडलेस सिविलाइजेशन है कि आप हफ्ते में एक दिन चर्च चले जाओ या मस्जिद चले जाओ और बाकी सारा वक्त जो है वो सिटी ऑफ गॉड, सिटी ऑफ मैन में आप वक्त गुजारे हो। लेकिन मैंने कहा था कि एक और बुक उसके बाद आई है, द सिटी, द सेंचुरी, गॉड सेंचुरी। Religion has staged a comeback, and it's very much, God is very much a part of our life. That's a very interesting discussion. Maybe at some point we will discuss that book as well. लेकिन अगर आप देखें कि चार्ल्स वॉर्नर की बुक जो कि 70s में या 60s में लिखी गई थी, कि उसके बाद की एटलीस्ट द लास्ट 2 centuries from the beginning of this millennium, religion has actually made its presence not only known, but it has also strengthened its place in the society. एक religiosity जो है वो बड़ी तेजी से उभरती आ रही है। तो अल्लाह मुझे माफ करा अगर मैं कुछ गलत सलत अपनी तरफ से कह गया हूँ। So this is where I will end, and we will open it for comments, questions, and Tahir Ali will lead the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Saleem Khanani. Very enlightened. I mean, you went through the whole book, you went through the whole chapter with a fine comb, and I think you covered everything. I think we'll open the room for discussion, and anybody wants to add up, and then we'll summarize it then also. So anybody who wants to come first, go ahead, please. Unmute yourself and then join in.
Assalamu alaikum. Salim bhai, you mentioned that in the early stages itself, Imam Abu Hanifa and other scholars, they established that in Islam, there is no separation of church and God. But yet what we see, what's going on in Saudi, if somebody speaks against them, they're either killed or imprisoned. Shouldn't the scholars of today, they should be calling that Saudi is not Islamic government anymore because they follow the separation of church and God? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, my thoughts are actually a little bit different here. और ये भी स्टडी है कि सऊदी अरब में भी एक बड़ा चेंज आ रहा है. You know, there was a union between the Ibn Wahab and his followers and Al Saud, where the government was like the monarch in the Middle Ages or even before that, and the church had its own domain. The church will not criticize the ruler. The ruler will support the church. The ruler needed the church to keep the people under control. And the church, जो हमारे जो मज़हबी उलमा, they wanted that their own ideology would be the exclusive ideology, religious ideology in Saudi Arabia. अगर आपने डिटेल में सुनना है तो यासिर कादी की 3 घंटे की वीडियो है, वो अगर आप चाहें तो वो YouTube पर आपको मिल जाएगी. उससे भी थोड़ा बहुत पता चलेगा, हिस्टोरिकली भी आपको पता चलेगा कि क्या हुआ था. But the ulama in Saudi Arab are not independent. If they criticize the government, you know what happens to them. Their khutbahs are also scrutinized before they can give a khutbah. You have to realize that. Okay, the ulama are not independent in Saudi Arabia. And now
I
whatever...
totally agree. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So my question was that the scholars of Islam who are not in Saudi Arabia, shouldn't they be criticizing, condemning Saudi Arabia's government and stop calling them as Islamic government?
Okay, there are 2 types of ulama in the Western world and the non-Saudi world. One are patronized. Okay? दूसरे जो है independent है, they've never accepted the Saudi authority anyway. Iranian को देख लें, शिया को देख लें आप लोग. They never accepted it anyway. लेकिन खड़ा होकर कहना जो है ना, इतना आसान नहीं है.
I agree. Yeah.
तो ये क्या कहें इस बात, कभी अलग से डिस्कस करेंगे, बैठ कर किसी के घर में बैठ के डिस्कस करेंगे.
अच्छा, आपने जो यासिर कादी का रेफरेंस दिया, do you know what should I search for? I think he has a lot of videos.
ये मैं ढूंढूंगा, अगर मुझे मैंने डॉक्टर मुश्ताक को भिजवाई थी, एक
अच्छा
3.5 घंटे की एक 17 मिनट का खुलासा इसका कि why did he change from the Wahhabi ideology to whatever his current views are now.
Okay, Shakula.
We'll just go up the line. उसके बाद आता है नंबर मोहम्मद यूसुफ साहब का. Mohammed Yusuf, would you like to say a few words?
It was a very good presentation and very elaborate and very enlightening. Thank you very much. I will leave it to others, for comments.
Okay, Irfan.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for such a nice presentation. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, no, I was just remembering that when all this 9/11 happened, and after that, there was a lot of discussion about what's going on in the Muslim world. So apparently, they were also saying the same thing, that the Muslims are in their middle ages, in the same problem as Europeans were in their middle ages, going through the same process. So a lot of it seems like a deja vu to them, probably. Although we Muslims have to figure out like how we are going to find our way out of this, because obviously whatever we are doing is not working at this point. So I'll see. I'll just keep listen to the discussion and see what his conclusion was in the further chapters. But it seems very interesting.
Yeah, the book is not current. No, this book was written, I find out, 1991 edition that I have. So it was obviously before 9/11, and it was at a time when the Cold War was just beginning to end. Nation states were emerging. The church had been put on the back burner. So for them, religion was already gone. It was now the city of men, not the city of God anymore. But since 9/11, things have changed, even in the European world.
Also, it was published in 1991. We don't know when he started writing, though.
Years ago, probably.
Yeah,
It's not easy to write a book like this.
exactly.
Tahir uska Munir साहब का हाथ उठा हुआ है.
Acha, okay, we'll go with him then. Okay, Munir Saab, go ahead. Unmute yourself, please. And the next one will be Khalil after that, and then after that will be Shahid Ikram, Akbar, Zahid, Imtiaz. Munir Saab, can you unmute? Oh, go ahead. We cannot hear you in case you are talking, Munir Saab. All right, can we go to Khalil then? Khalil Saab?
Ji, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Ji, Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Saab, you towards your end, in ending remarks, you said God is the very interesting part of the man's life. And earlier you said something, man is not free until and unless he accepts the will of God. And then you've been mentioning philosophers also. So I being the student of philosophy, you know, the Russo's social contract.
Yes.
At that time begins with the word that man is born free and everywhere is in chains.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I really strongly relate to this. And then Russo, you know, in its explanation, he says that, you know, not exploring himself actually has brought him from state of autonomy to this stage. So where he or she finds herself into the chains. So I mean, I really admire Islamic teachings, and I need your comments on that. Do you think it relates, the Russo's philosophy? And then Socrates has also said something on free will, and then Plato has also said something on free will. The same crux, but in different ways. So we were taught these things, you know, from Quran, and then I don't know what you said earlier. The acceptance of God's will sets the men free. Either it's Hadith or Quran. So how would you reflect all these, you know, from the Quranic point of view?
ये जो मैंने जो कोट किया था, मैंने वॉन डॉरन को कोट किया था, and he was actually talking about the thought process of many people going at that time, the debate between city of God and city of man, and that when you are in the city of God, then you are free because you freely choose to serve God's will. The question was, how do you know what's God's will? ठीक है ना? ये उस हवाले से उन्होंने बात की थी। जहाँ रूसो के आपने सोशल कॉन्टेक्ट की बात की थी, इट्स वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग एक्चुअली कि मैं एक बुक पढ़ रहा हूँ, उसका नाम है द डॉन ऑफ एवरीथिंग। उसकी बिगिनिंग रूसो के सोशल कॉन्टेक्ट से ही होती है, एंड द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ नोबल सैवेज, and that book actually challenges the long held views expressed by Russo and Hobbes and other philosophers about how history began and how did man come from where he was to where he is. That book is not focused on religion. It's mostly a sociological study of it, but it's a very important book, and if you are interested, you should read it. Maybe we can discuss it. Inshallah, मैं कराची आऊंगा तो आपसे मुलाकात होगी, बात होगी। हमारे यहाँ इस्लाम का जो मैं जो समझाऊं, और अगर समझने की बात आती है कि who can interpret the Islam for us, कुरान और हदीस में जो कुछ लिखा है, जहां तक मैं समझ पाया हूं कि लैसा लिल इंसान इल्ला मा सआ, इंसान को वही कुछ मिलता है जिसके लिए वो मेहनत करता है। जिसको इकबाल ने अमल से जिंदगी बनती है, जन्नत भी जहन्नम भी ये खाकी अपनी फितरत में न नूरी है न नारी है। कि इस्लाम ने हमको एसेटिज्म का सबक नहीं दिया है। कुरान हदीस आती है ला रहबानिया फिल इस्लाम, इस्लाम में रहबानियत नहीं है कि आप सब कुछ छोड़कर सिर्फ सिटी ऑफ गॉड में बैठ गए हो। इस्लाम ने तो अमल की तलकीन किया। हमारे सहाबा भी बिजनेस किया करते थे, बिजनेस के लिए सफर भी करते थे। तो अपने दीन के प्रिंसिपल्स को रखो, लेकिन दुनिया के बंदे बनो, वो काम करो जिससे दुनिया को फायदा पहुंचे, उसी से तुम्हारी आखिरत भी बनेगी। इस्लाम ने कहीं ये सबक नहीं दिया हुआ कि सिर्फ फजर के वक्त मस्जिद में जाओ और इशा के बाद पढ़कर जो है मस्जिद से निकल कर आओ। ये मेरी अपनी अंडरस्टैंडिंग है, लेकिन अगेन हमारे इस्लाम में भी जो यहाँ के जो मॉन्क्स है यहाँ पर, उनका यही कि सुबह से शाम तक वही अपने मॉनेस्ट्री में बैठे रहना है, हल्का फुल्का रूखी सूखी खाना, होमस्पन क्लोथ पहनना है और दुनिया को बिल्कुल छोड़ देना है। ये एक हमारे यहाँ भी कहते हैं कि शायद हमारे यहाँ सूफीज्म जो है वो उसकी भी इन्फ्लुएंस जो है वो क्रिश्चियन मॉन्क से ही इन्फ्लुएंस उसका आया। अगेन उसकी हिस्ट्री मैं इतना जानता नहीं हूँ, लेकिन जहाँ तक मुझे मेरी अंडरस्टैंडिंग कुरान की और हदीस की है कि अल्लाह ताला ने हमें दुनिया में अपना खलीफा बनाया है। दुनिया इसीलिए बनाई है और हमें दुनिया में इसलिए नहीं भेजा है कि दुनिया से हटकर बैठे रहें।
Yeah, that's what Maududi wrote in its book Towards Understanding Islam, that we are the vicegerent of God. Okay, all right. If you allow me, Tahir sahab, मैं एक दो lines पढ़ना चाहूँगा for this forum.
Go ahead.
Okay, all right. So मैंने Plato को mention किया, that Plato says once an individual has mastered oneself, only then can that individual express the free will. And then, Socrates says that believing that the unexamined life is not worth living was the wisdom and will for the self-control. So this is amazing. At that time, these leading philosophers are thinking on the Islamic lines. So actually, exploring yourself is exploring God, I guess. That's what the Sufism says.
अली रज़ियल्लाहु ताला कहने कि मन अरबा नफ्सहु अरफा रब्बहु, जिसने अपने आप को जहाँ पहचान लिया उसने रब को पहचान लिया। बात कहते हैं कि ये हदीस भी है। मैं रीजन को रेवलेशन से अलग नहीं समझता हूँ। देखा जाए तो कुछ चीजें, बहुत सी चीजें ऐसी हैं कि जो रीजन की समझ में नहीं आती हैं, जिसको आपने कांट को भी पढ़ा होगा कि जो ह्यूमन रीजन की लिमिटेशन पर उसमें लिखा हुआ है कि उन चीजों का जहाँ मेटाफिजिकल वर्ल्ड है वहां पर हमें रेवलेशन की जरूरत है, लेकिन रेवलेशन को समझने के लिए भी तो रीजन चाहिए ना।
I think Zahid, if you want to say something.
No, mashallah, Saleem bhai, excellent presentation as usual. I don't have anything to add or say.
Thank you. Munir sahab, whenever you're ready, we can inject you, but we should get your system working. In the meantime, Shahid Ikram, can you add your comments?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Saleem bhai. I know it's a big effort to do this. Where you must have put a lot of hours into it. So greatly appreciate. I read this chapter almost.
Yeah, take it over there.
Okay, so I read this chapter almost 3 times.
Me too.
And there is so much into it, and can expand. We can spend lifetime actually just on this chapter. Going to basically one thing, which is, reason versus faith. You were just talking about it. I mean, that is one of the, they spent 1,000 years on discussing this problem, and we are trying to understand in a very short time. Lekin isme I want to share with you, and probably you have seen it, but with other people. I have this Imam Ghazali book open in my hand, Imam Ghazali's Path to Sufism, his deliverance from error. Basically, और उसमें से page 29 से मैं आपको एक quote दे रहा हूँ. The categories of philosophers and the fact that stigma of unbelief is common to all of them. And philosopher, according to his definition, as of my understanding, is the people who reason and rationalize, try to rationalize things. And he, on the next 10 pages, basically he's saying, stay away from rationalism. And anybody who go into rationalism will eventually end up in unbelief. And so, his idea is very close to, Augustine. Basically, city of God and city of man. Don't rationalize and just keep those two things separate. Now, other way around, Ibn Rushd, as I understood him so far, and I have understood him very little, he says basically, whatever you cannot understand, everything has to be rationalized, and whatever you don't understand as a rationalize probably is allegorical. So it's a very different point of view between these two. And I think in a way we are still in this chapter, we are going back and forth on this idea. So what's your take on it? I mean, this is the question which is bothering, Muslims as well since Al-Ghazali time, because he went after the rationalist full time and tried to destroy them. And Muslims historically followed Ghazali's path. One reason of, at least my understanding, moving away from sciences and rationalism. And he went after them piece by piece. So that is a question I have for you. What your take on that?
पहली बात तो जो आपने साइंसेस की उसके लिए जो गजाली ने लफ्ज इस्तेमाल किया है वो है उलूम, ठीक है ना. और वो अपने उलूम मुरब्बिजा की बात कर रहे थे. वो फिजिक्स, केमिस्ट्री, जो आजकल की जो साइंसेस हैं, मेडिसिन के साइंसेस वगैरह, उनके हवाले से बात नहीं हो रही थी. उस जमाने में ये हो रहा था कि कैन यू अचीव द ट्रूथ थ्रू अ स्टडी ऑफ दोस फिजिकल साइंसेस एंड फिलॉसफी, ठीक है ना. तो वहां पर उसने कहा कि मैंने मैथमेटिक्स भी पढ़ी है, एस्ट्रोनॉमी भी पढ़ी है, फिलॉसफी भी पढ़ी है, और सच जो कि एब्सोल्यूट ट्रूथ है वो इन चीजों से हासिल नहीं हो सकता. तो अगर इब्न रुश्द का तो चलो ये था कि आप जो चीज आपको समझ में नहीं आती उसको आप एलेगोरिकल एक्सप्लेनेशन दे दें, ठीक है. वो रिजेक्शन की बात नहीं कर रहा था. लेकिन दूसरे फिलोसोफर्स उस पर जाएंगे कि जो चीज आपकी समझ में नहीं आती है उसे रिजेक्ट कर दो, ठीक है. तीन बुनियादी चीजें थी जिसमें इब्न रुश्द से गजाली का इख्तलाफ था, और वो उसने अपनी एक किताब लिखी है तहाफतुल फिलॉसफा, ठीक है, द डेविएशन ऑफ द और इनकोहेरेंस ऑफ द फिलोसफर्स. और उसका जवाब इब्न रुश्द ने लिया तहाफतुल तहाफा, इनकोहेरेंस ऑफ द इनकोहेरेंस. ये दोनों के दरमियान कभी बराह रास्त मुलाकात नहीं हुई थी कि बैठकर एक दूसरे के साथ डिस्कस कर सकते. और ये तीन चीजों थी, अगर मुझे याद रहता है, कि पहले तो थी कि ये यूनिवर्स जो है, इज इट को इटर्नल विद गॉड और डज इट कम इनटू एग्जिस्टेंस आफ्टरवर्ड्स. ये गजाली का था कि अल्लाह ने हर चीज को क्रिएट किया तो यूनिवर्स को भी क्रिएट किया है. इब्न रुश्द का डिफरेंट वे था, जो कि वो एक्चुअली कहा जाता है कि वो अरस्तू को कोट कर रहा था, उसकी अपनी नहीं थी. शिबली नौमानी ने उसको जब कोट किया तो अशरफ अली थानवी ने कुफर का फतवा उन पर लगा दिया था. ये भी बातें आई हमें. दूसरा था कि रिसरेक्शन जो है वो फिजिकल रिसरेक्शन है या स्पिरिचुअल रिसरेक्शन. गजाली को लगता है कि सिर्फ ये बात पहुंची थी कि फिलोसोफर्स कहते हैं कि रिसरेक्शन नहीं है, और इब्न रुश्द का ये कहना है. अगेन मैंने कहा कि इब्न रुश्द ने उसको एलेगोरिकली कहा, और ये मैंने खुद पढ़ा भी है कि फिलोसफी किताब में, कि रिसरेक्शन से मेरी मुराद ये नहीं है कि रिसरेक्शन है ही नहीं, बल्कि रिसरेक्शन से मेरी मुराद स्पिरिचुअल रिसरेक्शन. जबकि गजाली उन फिलोसोफर्स की बात कर रहे थे और वो समझे कि शायद इब्न रुश्द भी ये कह रहे हैं कि रिसरेक्शन है ही नहीं है, और चूंकि वो कुरान से साबित है रिसरेक्शन, लिहाजा वो कह रहे हैं कि अगर जो रिसरेक्शन का इनकार करेगा वो काफिर है, ठीक है. ये उस हिसाब से बात की. जबकि अगर इब्न रुश्द ने कहा कि उसको एलेगोरिकली एक्सप्लेन किया जाए, रिजेक्ट ना किया जाए, ठीक है. ये इंपॉर्टेंट चीज है। और तीसरी चीज थी कि अल्लाह ताला को यूनिवर्सल्स का इल्म है या पार्टिकुलर्स का इल्म, यानी होल पिक्चर का पता है या उस पिक्चर के हर पिक्सल का भी पता है, ठीक है ना। जो ट्रेडिशनल ये है कि अल्लाह हर चीज को जानता है, फिलोसफर्स का ये है कि अल्लाह ताला को हर चीज को जानने की जरूरत भी नहीं है, कि ओवरऑल उसको पता है, ठीक है ना। तो ये फिलोसफिकल आर्गुमेंट्स और डिफरेंसेस थे कि जिस पर गजाली ने बात की है, और उस पर लोगों ने कहा कि गजाली ने कहा कि फिलोसफी पढ़नी नहीं है, क्योंकि उनका ये कहना, जो मैंने खुद पढ़ा हुआ है, बुक को भी मैंने भी पढ़ा है, वो आगे और एक्सप्लेन करते हैं कि फर्ज करें कि आपको तैराकी आती है, ठीक है। आप एक दिन अपने बच्चे को लेकर जाते हैं समंदर के किनारे, और आप बच्चे से कहते हैं कि तुम यहाँ बैठो, मैं अभी तैराकी करके आता हूँ, और आपका बच्चा ऐसे कहता है नहीं मैं भी जंप लगाऊंगा, तो आप अपने बच्चे को जंप नहीं लगाने दोगे, क्योंकि ही इज नॉट देयर येट। तो उनका कहना था कि हर आदमी के जहन में फिलोसफी समझ में नहीं आ सकती है, लिहाजा अगर वो फिलोसफर्स की बातें पढ़ेगा तो मुमकिन है कि वो मिसगाइडेड हो जाए, ज्यादा चांस है कि मिसगाइडेड हो जाए। इनफैक्ट लजूनी ने मुझे फिलोसफी पढ़ने से रोक दिया। आई एम ऑनेस्टली सेइंग दिस थिंग। 20 साल पहले की बात है, जब मैं पढ़ना शुरू किया था, तो he said, you know, don't do it, because he said I went through an agonizing experience while studying philosophy from Iranian philosophers. तो फिलोसफी इतनी आसान चीज नहीं है, और गजाली का जो पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू था वो उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देखा जाए, इस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में नहीं कि उसने हर साइंस की स्टडी को रिजेक्ट करके कहा सिर्फ मजहबी किताबें पढ़ो। He didn't say this thing, he has been misunderstood. और मैं कहता हूँ गजाली और जो इब्न रुश्द में अगर बाहमी मुलाकात हो जाती तो शायद ये पॉइंट्स और बेहतर तौर पर डिस्कस हो सकते। तो अगर यही चीज है कि एक है रिजेक्शन कंप्लीटली, which according to Ghazali will be kufr because that goes against Quran. Or according to Ibn Rushd, what you don't understand, you try to explain in an allegorical fashion, जो कि आयत मुतशाबिहात की बात आ जाती है कि जन्नत और आखिरत की, जो मेरा अपनी क्लास में ये गुफ्तगू हो रही थी कि हुरों का वजूद है या नहीं है, क्या है, ये चीजें मुतशाबिहात में, इस पर हम कोई कंक्लूसिव आर्गुमेंट नहीं कर सकते। उस पर आप या तो ये कि चीजें सीधा सीधा बिलीव कर लो, ठीक है, कुरान में लिखा है इसको बिलीव कर लो, रिजेक्ट ना करो। दूसरा ये कि जैसे जावेद अहमद खामनी साहब करते हैं कि एल्गोरिकल एक्सप्लेनेशन दे दो। तो ये चीज को मैं एक्सप्लेन करना चाहता था कि जहां पर गजाली को भी मिसअंडरस्टूड किया गया।
Okay, thank you very much. I think, yeah. By the way, अभी जो आपसे I forgot अमीन साहब शायद या जिन्होंने बात की है रोसो की, हाँ रोसो की, हाँ जी, तो social contract and all that. Actually, it's very interesting topic in itself, and probably we can have a whole meeting on that. कि अगर आप देखें कि free mind, how much free it is. It is not free. Basically, most of the time we are conditioned, and all the marketing paradigm and आज के दौर में social media, you can see literally there is no free mind. You can condition anybody to do anything. So, but that's a different topic, and we can talk sometime about it. I mean, you can set it up for that. So thank you very much, everybody. I enjoyed greatly. Yeah.
भाग नहीं जाना है। अगला चैप्टर कौन करेगा?
अभी और लगे मुनीर साहब से मैं
अगला चैप्टर कौन करेगा? हमने एक जगह
अभी we are not done with it. We have a few more people who are to comment.
I know, लेकिन मैं ये पहले ये शायद भाग रहे हैं कि मेरा ख्याल हमने
मैं नहीं भाग रहा हूं,
नहीं भाग नहीं रहे। He's signing out only, that's all.
लेकिन ये still there. Sixth chapter हमने किसी को असाइन किया था, मुझे पता नहीं किसने लिया है।
अकबर मेरा ख्याल
अकबर वो आने वाला है, वो भी आने वाला है।
अस्सलाम वालेकुम। Do you want me to read that list that was finalized? I have it in my email.
मुझे भेज के दीजिएगा क्योंकि मैंने डिलीट कर दी है।
भेज अभी रहने दें, अभी let's continue on with the session. Munir साहब, are you okay now, or your system is still working or not? You can raise your hand. Otherwise, I think Akbar, you are next. Why don't you go ahead?
Assalamu alaikum. No, excellent talk. I think I would just make one comment, which I think it came up in the discussion. But I think there is important to have clarity on that point, and that is the actual message of the religion versus what the religious establishment or authority at any given time has that message or has that religious explanation or interpretation. I think it's really important because even in Islam and Christianity, the message has been interpreted differently at different points depending on what the religious authority was or is. So I think it's important to have that distinction between the actual message, say in case of Islam, the Quran, versus the religious interpretation at any given time.
a topic in itself, और उसमें किताबें भी लिखी गई हैं जो दो concept आते हैं. One is the concept of authenticity, particularly related to hadith. And the second is the authoritativeness. Who has the authority to interpret the divine text? क्योंकि हमारे यहाँ पर जो कहा जाता है कि जो हमारी शरीयत की बुनियाद दो चीज़ों पर है, कुरान और हदीस. वहाँ पर इंसानी अक्ल को बहुत पीछे रखा जाता है. उससे पहले सहाबा की opinion, ताबेन की opinion, consensus of scholar, which is collective wisdom, which I would say collective wisdom is the human mind, is the human reason, which works at two levels. The first level is that when you have a text, Quran or Hadith, you derive the ruling based upon or understand the message of the text. दूसरा level जहाँ पर reason काम करता है वो है कि when there is no text available to deal with the situation, what do you do at that time? Do you accept the decisions of the earlier generations as a decision forever? Or do you have the choice of coming up with a different answer based upon the time period you are living in and based upon the resources that you have? लेकिन हदीस में यहाँ पर authenticity का मामला भी आ जाता है कि how authentic a hadith is. And secondly, who has the authority to say conclusively that this is what Allah means and this is what the Prophet ﷺ meant. ये इस issue पर भी बहुत discussion हुई है. इस issue पर किताबें भी लिखी गई. मेरे पास एक किताब है अगर आप पढ़ना चाहें तो उसमें उन्होंने इकबाल, अफगानी और अरकून तीन बड़े मुफक्किर हैं जिन्होंने इस मौजू को बड़ा डिटेल में डिस्कस किया है. उनके कामों पर उन्होंने डिस्कशन की है. उसके हवाले से इन सवालात को आंसर करने की कोशिश की. और दूसरे खालिद अबुल फजल के रीजनिंग विद गॉड भी लिखी और द ग्रेट थेफ्ट के आवर रिलीजन हैज बीन हाईजैक्ड इन अ वे. How do we deal with that situation? अपने तौर पर is everybody qualified to interpret the religion on his own? If not, then obviously we have to depend upon somebody. हम में से अरबी बहुत कम लोगों को आती है. हमें कुरान का तर्जुमा पढ़ना पड़ता है, हमें कुरान की तफसीर पढ़ना पड़ती है. लेकिन क्या सिर्फ तर्जुमा पढ़कर हम अपनी इंटरप्रिटेशन कर सकते हैं? और दूसरा है कि how much can we rely upon the translation of somebody? जब मैं कुरान की तफसीर का करता हूँ तो मैं आपके सामने 4-5 तर्जुमे रखता हूँ और बाज़ औक़ात आप देखेंगे कि तर्जुमे भी मुख्तलिफ है. So who has the authority to translate actually the verses, let alone interpret? It's not that easy कि हमें कहीं ना कहीं किसी ना किसी पर हमें भरोसा करना ही पड़ता है. Unless we are at a level where we can say we don't need anybody and we can interpret the divine will on our own.
Thank you. Imtiaz, he's from Dubai. He's from Dubai. While we are shivering here, he's basking in the sun over there.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. So this is a great presentation, as I learn all the time whenever I attend this presentation. I'm nothing to add, but it's definitely a great learning opportunity to listen all depth knowledge from you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, Munir Saab has actually exited and he might try to come back. Unfortunately, he had a good comment, but he was unable to communicate to us because of his system problem. So while we'll wait for him if he comes back. So in the meantime, I'll first of all, yes, Saleem Khanani, very well done, very extensive and very highly motivative, and also very you went into a great depth. I mean, of course, Von Gordon goes into depth anyways with his book, but you also dive into it from a different angle of it, and you bring your own points as you go along, which is what we should do always anyways. And the good thing, one of the things that I was looking at it when you were saying that how the languages make the knowledge of language give you the criteria of being into a scholarly matter or an educated person. For example, you said Latin and I think Greek, right? Those are the two languages at that time. And if you knew them, that would become you are a scholar or something. Or if you look at India, if anybody who knows Sanskrit and Hindi or whatever, Sanskrit and other language, he's also now goes to another level of man. I mean, he's like he becomes a Pandit or anything. Persian in Urdu, along with Urdu, studied along with Urdu, gives you the poetic sort of status there. and obviously then Arabic and on the other hand, but again you have to add that to become the religious portion of this. So religion always makes the languages always make a big difference in how you go around. Like you said here, if you know Arabic, आपको Arabic आती है तो आप कुरान अच्छी तरह समझ लेंगे, and then translation भी समझ में आएगा तो ज़्यादा मजा आएगा if you know the languages. And so that's what happened there also. The other angle that you put up was which I wanted to bring it in a different way. You talked about Charlemagne. Yeah, okay. And he was also known as the
only
Charles
Roman emperor.
Yeah, the Charles the Great of Franks. Charles the Great of the Franks. And he was the one who actually, and you mentioned that, he actually prevented the Muslims, the Ottoman Empire, to actually spread through the European. The reason he did that is because he was able to unite the Western and the Europeans, the Eastern Western. He was able to unite all these Europeans so that they were able to become a wall against the Ottoman Empire. Otherwise, you're right. It's going to sweep over the thing. So anybody in the historical figure, if you notice, is able to combine the tribes, different tribes in all over the place, or different mentality, brings them into one mindset. He becomes a leader. He actually builds the society. He strengthens the society and the religion. Ottoman Empire did the same thing. The Osmania, he did the same thing. He combined all the tribes together and was able to fight. In our last time when we read the book, The Ottoman Empire, remember somebody had mentioned that the Mongols had actually, I forgot the name of the Mongol, Genghis Khan, I think. He was the one who was able to unite all of the Mongol tribes and became a power. So anybody who has an ability to combine people and bring one on the same table becomes a leader. Not only becomes a leader, he becomes also starts to shape the history of mankind. Exactly what he's talking about. You mentioned Becket. I remember Shakespeare also had written about Becket, Thomas Becket, and I think there was a movie on it also where we had Charles, Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton. Again, there was a thing, both were friends together, and when Peter O'Toole, when Peter O'Toole, who played Henry II, figured that the church is always against me, why don't I have my friend be the archbishop, and he became but as soon as you assume that role, being an archbishop, Becket understood the laws of his religion, and he then started to oppose Henry II with his own wishful thinking and all that. So he became mind. So the reading and also getting into the thing of the matter is very important. And I think this is what the history of world is being narrated, the way he's doing it and the way you narrated. I think that's the beauty about this whole book. He's bringing everything together so that you can start thinking like that. And thank you for that. That's all I had to say. If you want to add anything to that, please.
Tahir bhai, मैं सिर्फ आपकी बातों पर बहुत अच्छा आपने you put it very well. Sir, historically, I just wanted to correct one thing.
Okay.
Charlemagne was not at the time of Ottomans, so there are like 500-year difference. So he did not stop Ottoman.
Abbasid की बात था, Abbasid.
हाँ. तो मैंने सिर्फ I'm sorry,
No, thank you. I just didn't mix that. I was trying to talk about unity against.
No, you are right on that. Yes.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
ये बताएं कि नेक्स्ट चैप्टर किसने करना है अकबर, ताकि हम उनको असाइन कर दें, इंशाल्लाह फिर नेक्स्ट मंथ कर सकते हैं।